When disaster strikes, the last thing you want to worry about is what's for dinner. Today, I'm sharing what I do to ensure my family stays nourished when it matters most. Hey guys, it's Jara with Wicked Prepared. Welcome back to the channel. We know that when hurricanes or other emergencies hit, it can be chaotic and cooking might be the last thing on your mind, but you still need to feed your family. While it's important to stock your home with snacks and food options that don't require cooking, these are the times more than ever when people need and deserve a warm, home-cooked meal. This is one reason we love to stock our prepper pantry with just add water meals in a jar. Just grab a jar off the shelf, add water, and that's all you need to have a warm, hearty meal that's a million times better and healthier than anything you can get from any of those survival buckets or any can off the grocery store shelf. You can control the ingredients and avoid the things that we don't want in our food. These are not pressure canned meals. There's no special equipment needed. Anyone can make these meals. Let's dive in and ensure that you're ready to tackle mealtime, even in the toughest situations. We have a whole library of meal in a jar recipes, but today I'm showing you some basic soup recipes. It's definitely soup season, at least where we live. I've been wanting to start a series of simple, classic soups, and this will be my first installment. Make sure to give me a thumbs up down below if you want to see more videos like this one. Today I'm doing 3 different classic soup recipes, and the first one is a classic chicken noodle. Let's get started. Besides the ingredients, the only equipment we're going to need for these meals in a jar are going to be mason jars. I typically use a quart-size wide mouth mason jar for my regular size meals. You're going to want some kind of a funnel to get your items into the jar. This is just a simple canning funnel. And we're going to need some basic measuring utensils for measuring out our ingredients. You want a sealing type of lid to use on your jar. And then if you want to put these away for longer term storage, you're going to want to use an oxygen absorber. Or some people will just use their vacuum sealer on the mason jar once they get everything into the jar. Personally, I think that an oxygen absorber makes it last longer on the shelf, but that's just my opinion. For our chicken noodle soup, I'm going to be using some medium egg noodles today. You could use whatever kind of egg noodles you wanted. Just keep in mind that the bulkier the noodles, the less noodles you're going to get in your jar. So if you use a less bulky noodle, you might end up with more noodles. I'm going to use 2 cups of the noodles today. Next, I'm going to add what we need for our broth. So I'm going to add some chicken bouillon. Now, I have been buying a better chicken bouillon than this, but I do have some bouillons to use up, so I'm going to be using this one. Now, keep in mind, you can always change the amount of bouillon based on either your tastes or your health needs. If you like things saltier or less salty, you can adjust that. If you use a different brand, you may end up needing to adjust the amounts as well, because sometimes they're different. This one tastes good, but you can see it has some not so great ingredients. So I have started buying a better bouillon, but I have to use these up first. Now I'm going to use 2 tablespoons of the bouillon. I'm going to use some parsley flakes, using a tablespoon of these. I'm going to be adding some dried thyme, half a teaspoon of the dried thyme. I'm going to be adding some black pepper, half a teaspoon of the black pepper as well. And I'm going to be adding some turmeric. Now my label came off of here, but this is turmeric. Now let's talk about turmeric for a minute. Turmeric is something that it's very good for your health. It's anti-inflammatory, and it's also good for your immune system. It's an immune booster. So I always like to add this. For our family, chicken noodle soup is something that we typically have when somebody's sick. I would serve that to somebody who's sick. We don't typically just have it for lunch. So I like to have turmeric in it just for that added benefit for the immune system. And that also works with the black pepper. You really need some black pepper with your turmeric to help your body absorb it. But it also has a really nice yellow color, so it can really add some natural color to your dishes. So it kind of makes it a little bit like Campbell's chicken noodle soup. I know that nowadays we think of that as not being the healthiest stuff in the world, but I think a lot of us have some nostalgia about growing up with Campbell's chicken noodle soup, so I know I do. I'm only going to put in a 1/4 teaspoon of this. Now you could put more if you like. I wouldn't go more than a half a teaspoon because I think if you get too much, it can give it kind of a bitter flavor. And other than that, I don't really notice the flavor of the turmeric. It's really just there for the medicinal benefits for me. But it's also going to make the color a lot more yellow if you add the half a teaspoon. So depending on how you want your soup to look, you can judge on that. And you could just leave it out if you wanted to. Next, I'm going to add some freeze-dried chopped onion, a 1/4 cup of the onion. You could also add some garlic in here because that also has some good benefits for your immune system. I'm not adding garlic today, but if you are a garlic fan, then go ahead and add some of that. I am going to add some peas, which isn't really something I would typically think of in chicken noodle soup, but I thought it would be good to add a little bit more protein, a little bit more veggie, a little bit more nutrition. Doing a half a cup of the peas. And then I'm going to be adding some carrot. Now these are dehydrated carrots. These are not freeze-dried. You'll find that most commercial companies don't offer freeze-dried carrots right now because carrots have a strange way of, they tend to turn white after they've been freeze-dried. I'm sure that they sometimes don't turn white. So if you freeze-dried them and not had them turn white, that's great. But commercial companies usually don't want to put out a product that's going to be unreliable or unpredictable, or that, you know, a good percentage of their customers might not be happy with. I'm not a huge fan of dehydrated carrots. I have freeze-dried carrots myself and they did turn white, but I might play around with that a little bit more and see if I can't get some that I'm happy with. And there are a couple companies who do offer them for sale. I'm not real familiar with these companies, but I think I'm going to check them out and check out the product. One company I'm a little familiar with and I'm not a huge fan of them. The other company I'm not familiar with at all. But I am going to check it out a little bit and see if we can't get our hands on some freeze-dried carrots that are half decent. I'm only using a quarter cup of the carrot, dehydrated, because it shrinks and shrivels so much when it's dehydrated. And the flavor changes, it concentrates, gets pretty strong. So I'm not a huge fan of the flavor of dehydrated carrots, and they will swell up, so you don't want to use too many or it gets overpowering. So this is a quarter cup of the dehydrated carrots. And I will say, if you do use freeze-dried, if you have some that you freeze-dried yourself, then you will probably want to add a little bit more than a quarter cup, because the freeze-dried don't shrink. Because when you freeze-dry something, the cell structure is maintained. It doesn't break down the cell structure like dehydrating does. So the freeze-dried food stays the same size as it was when it was fresh. Same size, same shape. So you would probably want to increase the amount of carrots by 2 or 3 times as many carrots if you can fit them in the jar if you do use freeze-dried. Next, I'm going to be adding some celery. This is freeze-dried celery. I'm adding a half a cup of this. So likewise, if you wanted to go with dehydrated celery, I think that would be okay, but you wouldn't want to use this much. You'd want to use much less of a dehydrated product. You'd also need to adjust the cook time probably and the water amount to account for that. And next I'm going to add, of course, the chicken. So I'm using freeze-dried chicken. This is grilled chicken dices, and I'm using this one because this is what happens to be on sale right now. So I know that I've restocked my supply with a case of chicken that's coming. But you can use whatever form of chicken you have that's freeze-dried, whether you've purchased it or freeze-dried it yourself. You could use sliced, diced, shredded. Any chicken that you have will work. I'm going to be using 3/4 of a cup, so I've got a half a cup here. This jar is getting pretty full. And then I'm using my final quarter cup. You can press down on this if you need to. Now, I just want to show you real quick. When you get to the bottom of a can, or in my case, a canister of freeze-dried foods, a lot of the times you'll have that bit of powder and small bits at the end. That's just kind of the nature of freeze-dried foods, because they're kind of a little bit fragile. So when they're being shipped around and tossed around your house, they're going to break down a little bit. That is not something that you want to throw away. I will add that a lot of the time to dishes like this, soups, stews, sauces, anything like that. And it adds a really great bit of, you know, the chicken flavor. And you can also use that to make your own, to use it within your own sort of bouillon mixes if you want to do that. Or another thing that I will do is sometimes I will put that into a little shaker jar, and I will actually use it for my dogs and cats to shake it on their food. We have a couple of dogs that are a little bit more finicky and they don't want to eat their food unless there's something special on it for them usually. And I spend good money buying freeze-dried food for my pets, freeze-dried treats, freeze-dried food toppers. So when I can take this little bit of powder that's left from my canister or my can and use it for something, I always will do that. Definitely don't get rid of that powder. Now this jar is all ready. If you were going to be putting this away on the shelf for long-term storage, you'd want to add an oxygen absorber before you put on the lid. I used 200cc oxygen absorbers in a jar this size usually. But I am not going to put this one on the shelf. I'm going to be actually cooking this one up today to show you how it comes out. So I'm not going to use an oxygen absorber. I'm just going to go ahead and add the lid. And our chicken noodle soup is ready to go on the shelf. It would also be perfect for gifting to somebody who was sick maybe, or somebody who just needed a little bit of comfort. Now let's fix up our chicken noodle soup. Now to fix this up, I'm going to be using my butane emergency stove. Now let's talk about the stove for a minute. This is my choice, my first pick for cooking indoors in an emergency whenever the power's out, because we have an electric stove. I get a lot of people ask me about this stove and about whether these are safe for cooking indoors. Now, I did a lot of research before I settled on this type of stove, and I feel like this is a safe choice for cooking indoors based on what I've researched. A lot of caterers use butane burners, and in a lot of Asian countries, they use these for pretty regular cooking inside their homes. You will see a lot of these sold with a warning that it's not for indoor use. I personally think that they're just kind of covering their butts. However, that being said, we do have carbon monoxide detectors in our home. We keep extra carbon monoxide detectors with digital readouts with our emergency gear, so that at any time that we're using alternative fuels and alternative appliances in the house, we have that extra safety backup. You guys have probably seen me use this stove in my house time and time again, and it's always been fine. But what I recommend, of course, like with anything else, is that you do your own research and make your own decisions and decide what you think is appropriate for you. Now let's get started with our soup. I've got my soup pot, and I'm going to go ahead and just open up my soup here, my soup mix, and just dump the whole thing right in the pot. And I'm going to add 8 cups of water to this soup mix. Now keep in mind, if you're in an emergency and you're limited on what you have available, you can use your mason jar for measuring water. I use that a lot. I'm not sure exactly how accurate it is, but with something like a soup, that's not going to be that important, because if you have a little more or a little less water, it's going to be fine. And even if I'm not measuring it with the mason jar, I do like to usually pour the water into the mason jar first, just to make sure that if there's any residual powders left in the jar, that we'll get those all rinsed out. We won't be wasting anything. All right, so there's our 8 cups of water. Now I'm going to go ahead and get the heat right on this one. This meal does not have to sit at all in the cold water before the heat's applied. And it can be on a pretty high heat. We really just want to get this brought up to temperature, brought up to a simmer. I'm going to go ahead and put a lid on this just because it's going to keep the heat in a little bit and let us get it boiling a little bit quicker. All right, you can see this is starting to boil, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the heat down so it can just stay at a simmer. And we're going to simmer this for about 8 to 10 minutes. It just has to be long enough for those noodles to get soft, because the chicken will already be tender at that point, and it will be ready to eat. And keep in mind, the noodles were in there from the beginning with the cold water, so it probably won't even take as long as it would if we had just dumped them right in the boiling water. So a nice slow simmer for about 8 or 10 minutes. All right, it has been about 5 minutes, and already the noodles are tender. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is turn off the heat, and we're going to let this set for a few minutes, because usually if you let it set, that's going to help assimilate these ingredients. So anything that's sort of floating will sort of get assimilated. The soup will cool down a little bit so that we don't burn our mouths and all of that. And then it will be ready to serve. Okay, it's been about 5 or 10 minutes, and you can see that the soup has really come together. It's all, I call it assimilated, but I guess you could call it whatever you want. So I'm going to serve this up. It's still pretty hot. And there is our comforting bowl of hot chicken noodle soup. All right, let's give it a try. Oh wow, that is amazing. That is delicious. Wow, that is perfect. So good. For my next soup, I'll be doing a delicious beef and barley soup. So for the beef and barley soup, I'm going to be starting with some freeze-dried beef. I'm using diced beef. I can see I need to open a new can here. I'm using diced beef, but you could use any shape of beef that you want, or even ground beef if that's what you have. But I'm using 1 cup of the diced beef. And the next ingredient is going to be the barley. I am using quick cooking barley. This is going to cook more quickly, just like in a minute rice or in instant beans, so that we don't have to waste a lot of our precious fuel. Besides, freeze-dried food cooks very quickly, and so we don't want to have all the other ingredients in here simmering for a really long time just to get the barley cooked. The idea with these meals in a jar is that they're usually really quick and easy to prepare. I'm using a 1/2 cup of the quick barley. And next, I'm going to be using an espagnole, which is a beef gravy mix. I do have a copycat recipe for this. I'll link that video down below in case you can't get your hands on this. I'm using 1/3 cup of the espagnole. Now, this is a beef gravy that has a little bit of tomato element to it, just a little bit. So this is going to be different than using like a brown gravy or something. So if you don't have the espagnole and you can't get the espagnole, which I will link to that down below in the description box, then I would suggest trying to make the copycat recipe just so that you get the same effect. I am going to be adding some beef bouillon as well. I'm going to be using 1.5 tablespoons of this. Now, of course, you can customize this by changing up the amount of bouillon, because if you need to eat less salt, or you prefer your food less salty, or maybe you like it more salty, this is the amount that works for us. And it also might depend on what brand you're using. I will tell you what brands I'm using down in the description box below the video, because different brands can have different flavors, different saltiness levels. This one right here is a Thrive Life bouillon, which I like because it has no MSG and it has a lot more natural ingredients. But I do have some other bouillons that I'm using up before I fully move on to these. And so I'll definitely tell you what brands of everything I'm using in this recipe, because that's what I tested the recipe with. Next, I'm going to be using some red wine powder. Now, I will say this is an optional ingredient because this is a little bit more difficult to find. I've only found this in one place, and I will link that down below. But just like when you follow any typical recipe and they say the red wine is optional, you don't have to add this ingredient if you don't have it and you don't want to get it. I think I paid about $10 for this amount of red wine powder. This is not red wine vinegar powder, it's red wine powder. So I'll definitely say that this is an optional ingredient, but just like adding some red wine into your beef stew or your beef dishes, it is going to add a little bit of complexity to that flavor. I'm also going to be adding some Worcestershire sauce powder. Adding a teaspoon of that. I'm going to add parsley flakes. So I'm going to do a teaspoon of the parsley flakes. And I'm going to be using some dried thyme. Now, these spice dispensers that I use, I love these. They do have a dial that will dispense 1/4 teaspoon. And I use that a lot of the time. You can do how many clicks you want. But sometimes with thyme, because it's like long pieces of leaf that are kind of stiff, it can get kind of caught in between the little channels of this. So I can just use something to scrape it out or tap it out. But sometimes I just like to open it up and scoop out my thyme. So that's 1/4 teaspoon of thyme. I'm also going to add 2 teaspoons of freeze-dried minced garlic. That gives it a really nice fresh garlic flavor. If you don't have that, you could go ahead and add probably about 1 teaspoon of garlic powder. Now I'm going to be adding some freeze-dried chopped onion, 1/4 cup of the onion, and I'm going to be adding some carrots. Now these carrots are not freeze-dried, they're dehydrated. So I'm only using 1/4 cup of these carrots, and they will somewhat swell in this mixture. So if you do use freeze-dried, you would want to use more of the freeze-dried carrots than you would of the dehydrated, because freeze-dried foods do not shrink and shrivel like dehydrated does, because it maintains the structure of the cells in that food. It doesn't break down the cell structure. So they don't shrink. So you would need a little bit more if you're using, well, not even a little bit more, at least twice to 3 times as much if you're using a freeze-dried product rather than dehydrated. The next ingredient I'm going to add is some freeze-dried tomato dices, diced tomato. Now, my canister is being washed right now because I emptied it out. So I'm just going to open the can, but this is probably good to show people, because a lot of people see these videos and they think that they have to have their own freeze dryer in order to do meals in a jar like this. And that's just not the case. There's so many people who don't have their own freeze dryer or don't want to have a freeze dryer who still do meals in a jar just by purchasing freeze-dried foods. And I even have a lot of friends who do have a freeze dryer who still purchase a lot of freeze-dried foods for these recipes. because freeze drying is a very complicated process. So some people prefer to buy certain things already done. I don't know why some people think of it as kind of an all or nothing proposition. Like, I didn't stop buying canned vegetables and canned meat at the store the moment I bought a pressure canner. I do a little bit of both, like most people do. Most people do a little bit of both. There may be some people out there who pressure can every single item that their family eats, but most of us do a mixture of both. You can see this is the system that we do use to inventory and keep track of some of the foods in our food storage. So this is a can that we've had since 2021, and this QR code just helped us locate it within the app that we use. But these smaller cans usually have a pop top, so they're super easy to open. And then they do have an oxygen absorber in there, which this is all used up at the time that you open this can, so you can just discard this. And a lot of people will just keep their food in these cans in their pantry. Like I mentioned, I put mine into my canisters, but only the food that I'm using, not food that I'm storing for longer terms, because my canisters are clear, so it does allow light in. I keep them in a dark pantry, but it's best not to let light in. So they're also not 100% airtight. So a better choice, if you're not going to use them up quickly, would be a mason jar if you don't want to leave them in the can. I'm using 3/4 of a cup of the tomato dices. So I've got 1/2 of a cup and 1/4 cup. And then my final ingredient is going to be some freeze-dried celery. And I'm going to be using 1/2 cup of the freeze-dried celery. And there's my jar all ready to go. Now, if I was going to be storing this on the shelf for the long term, I would definitely want to add an oxygen absorber before I add the lid. And that would eat up all the oxygen in the jar so the food will stay good. It would kind of make a seal on this lid, although you leave the ring on with your oxygen absorbers, or at least I do. I am going to be cooking this up today to show you how it comes out, so I don't need the oxygen absorber. I use 200 cc's, by the way, for a quart size mason jar. So here is our beautiful beef and barley soup mix all ready to go. Now let's fix up our beef and barley soup. I've got my soup pot here, and I'm just going to go ahead and dump in this whole jar of soup mix. And I'm going to add 6 cups of cold water. That's something I should probably mention, that in my recipes, unless it's otherwise specified, I'm always starting with cold water. And just like with the chicken noodle, I don't really need to wait to turn the heat on. So I'm going to get the heat turned right on this pot. And just give this a stir, get everything moistened. And everything blended in. The nice thing with these sauce mixes is that they blend really well with water. You don't really need to worry about getting clumps, even if you're blending them into hot liquids. Usually they work really well. I'm going to go ahead and get my lid on just to keep that heat in there and let this come up to a boil faster. And then we're just going to have to simmer it for about 10 or so minutes. Okay, this has come up to a boil, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the heat down. And we just want to simmer this. It's going to simmer gently with the lid on for about 10 minutes or so. That's all it takes for that barley to get soft and ready, because it is a quick barley. So I'm going to simmer it for that amount of time. And then just like the other soup, we are going to let it set for 10 or so minutes after it's done simmering. And then it'll be ready to serve. All right, let's let this simmer. I'll see you back when it's done. Okay, so it's been about 10 minutes. And this is looking pretty good. I don't know if you can see that. It's thickened up a little bit because of that sauce mix that we put in here has a little bit of thickening, not a lot. And then, of course, the barley cooking in here is going to put off some starches and absorb some water and help it thicken also. So this is going to set for about 10 minutes just to help everything really assimilate. And that barley is going to keep swelling a little bit as it sits, because that's just what barley does. So this is going to set for about 10 minutes and then it will be ready to serve. All right. This soup is beautiful and ready to serve. Just look at that. This looks so good. I cannot wait to try it. All those chunks of beef. Look at the vegetables. That is really, really good. That beef is so tender. It always amazes me that you can have such good texture in your meats, even with shelf stable. The final soup recipe I'm doing today is going to be a yummy broccoli and cheese soup. For this one, I'm going to be using this cheddar cheese sauce, actually 3 cheese sauce mix as a base for the soup. These are really, really good. And it's just a really easy way to do this because this contains the cheese ingredients, it contains the milk ingredients, it contains the butter ingredients, it contains the thickening ingredients, everything that you would need for the cheese sauce. So instead of having to buy or gather all of those things, we just need this. This is from Hoosier Hill Farms, and I do really like these sauce mixes. They have instructions on the side of basically how to make like a soup base, a sauce, or a dip. So you make it thin, thicker, or thickest to use it many different ways. I am going to be adding 3/4 of a cup of the cheese sauce mix. So there's a 1/2 cup. Now notice I'm adding my powdered ingredients first on this recipe. So this is a really good place to illustrate why we would do this or not do this. So the powdered ingredients, if I was adding the broccoli and the chunkier ingredients first and then putting the powders on top, the powders would sift down and fill the spaces among those chunkier ingredients, and they would take up less space. So we would be able to fit a lot more in the jar. This soup doesn't have a lot of ingredients because it's really just broccoli and cheese for the most part. So we have a little more space to work with in the jar. And I don't like to leave a lot of empty space in my jars, so I'm putting the powders on the bottom so everything else will sit on top of the powders and it will fill the jar more. And the jar will look a little bit prettier that way because the powders won't be mixed in with everything else. So that's something to remember. If you need to fit more ingredients into your jar, you want to put your bulkier ingredients first and your powdery ingredients up further so they can filter in. And then if you want your jar to be prettier and you don't have to worry as much about space, you would put your powdered ingredients on the bottom and then the bulkier ingredients layered on top. So I've got a 1/2 cup in here. Before I forget what I'm doing, I need a 1/4 cup now to make 3/4 of a cup total of the cheese sauce mix. I'm also going to be using chicken bouillon. So a teaspoon of the chicken bouillon, a 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, and also a 1/4 teaspoon of paprika. This is just regular paprika, not the smoked kind or the spicy kind or anything like that. And next I'll also add my freeze-dried chopped onion, a 1/4 cup of the onion. And now I'm going to add my broccoli, freeze-dried broccoli, which I'm getting low on. You can tell this is one of my favorite ingredients because it's really the only way that you can have broccoli in your prepper pantry. And we love broccoli. It's a favorite veggie. And it's really nutritious. So I like to have that and know that I'm going to have that no matter what happens. And not only is this good in recipes, but it's also good just straight out of the can. It's a nice crunchy veggie snack. And you can even use these freeze-dried veggies as like crudités. Like, so you can serve them just dry with dip or hummus or something like that. And it's really, really good. Now I am going to be chopping a lot of this up into smaller bits, but I do want about a 1/2 cup of whole florets or bigger pieces that I'm going to add into the soup at the top. So I'm just going to take out a 1/2 cup worth of some of the nicer pieces. I am down to the bottom of my canister, which means it's a lot of the powdery kind of, you know, pieces that have sifted down. So there's not as much of the nicer pieces down at the bottom, which is actually perfect for broccoli cheddar soup. When I do come to the end of a canister or a can and I have the powdery bits that are left in the bottom and that's all that I have, I will take the broccoli bits and I will save them in their own small mason jar because they're great to add to broccoli cheese soup. I'm going to be using a 1.5 cups of the broccoli to chop up into smaller bits. So I've got a cup here. And I'm just going to use a little, this is a little manual chopper. Any kind of small food processor that you have would be good for this if you have one. I would not use like a bullet blender type of thing because those will really powder it. And I personally don't want my broccoli really powdered. I want some smaller pieces, but I don't want it just a green powder. So a mini food processor will work great. You could also put it into a Ziploc bag and bang it with a rolling pin. That usually works. Or you could even put it onto a chopping board and just roughly chop it with a knife. But if it's really dry and crispy and fresh, that might send it flying. So something like this that can keep it contained is a little bit better. So I've got my cup and I just need another half of a cup. See what I mean about these small bits in here at the bottom of the canister? These are actually perfect to save in a small jar and just throw in whenever you make like a broccoli cheese soup. All right, so that's pretty good. There's still some bigger chunks and there's some smaller bits too. That's exactly how I want it. All right, so I'm just gonna dump this right into the jar. Now I'm going to be adding some dehydrated carrots. The dehydrated carrots are actually pretty good for the broccoli cheese soup because in a broccoli cheese soup, you really would just have little bits of carrot usually. So you might have like shredded carrot. So if you have some dehydrated shredded carrot that you've made yourself, you could use that. I'm just going to be using these store-bought dehydrated chopped carrots, just a 1/4 cup of these. And now I'm going to be using freeze-dried shredded cheddar cheese. This is another favorite ingredient. So this is almost empty because how else would you have real shredded cheddar cheese shelf stable in your pantry? And we are a cheese loving family. We love cheese on just about everything. Casseroles, quesadillas, anything you could put cheese on, we love it. So I like to make sure that I'm always going to have it no matter what. It's also handy because I can just make up and refresh just the amount that I need. So I don't end up with bags of cheese that end up moldy because we don't use it fast enough if we make it as we need it. So this is a cup of the shredded cheddar going right in here and all over the counter. I'm going to give this a jiggle. And then all I've got left to add is this 1/2 cup of whole broccoli florets that I kept out. That'll give us some nice unbroken chunks in our soup. So like with our other soups, if you were going to put this away on the shelf for the long term, you'd want to add an oxygen absorber on the top. And then, of course, our lid. Now, make sure you're always using the actual airtight, like canning, sealing lid on these and not just a plastic storage lid because you want to make sure that it's going to seal up and keep the air out. And here is our broccoli cheese soup all ready to go. And now I'm going to fix up the broccoli cheddar soup and I'm going to show you just how easy it is to make a meal out of this, how quickly it comes together, and what it looks like when it's all finished. Once again, I've got my butane burner and my big soup pot, Dutch oven, whatever you want to call this. I'm just going to go ahead and open up my broccoli cheddar soup mix and dump it right into the pot. Now I'm going to be using 5 cups of cold water for this recipe, but this time I'm going to pour the water in, I'm going to give it a good mix, get everything moistened, and I am going to let it set for about 15 minutes in the cold water before I apply the heat. In this recipe, my main reason for doing that is because I want the cheese to sort of start to refresh itself in the cold water before I apply the heat, because that way the cheese can sort of refresh itself back to its fresh cheese state and it will melt a lot better than if it was just put right into hot water, put into the heat. You want to refresh your cheese always in cold water. Right, so there's my first 4 cups and my last cup. So 5 cups of cold water. And I am just going to blend this together until the powder's all mixed in and everything's moistened. Now you can use a whisk if you feel the need to get this powder mixed in, but I think it's going to do just fine without it for now. I might use a whisk a little bit later. It is blending in pretty well and it's going to continue to sort of dissolve and blend as it sits. So I am going to let this set just about 15 minutes in the cold water. I'm not turning this on. Just going to put a lid on it to keep it covered and I'll see you back when it's done. All right, so it's been 15 minutes. So now I'm going to be able to apply the heat. Now you can see that this has already thickened up quite a bit because the type of thickener that this sauce mix uses doesn't actually need boiling to thicken. Because if you look at the instructions on the side of the can where it tells you how to make dips and sauces and soups, it just says to stir in boiling water. And I tried it, I tested it that way and was able to just stir in boiling water and it was thick. So mostly what we're going to be doing here is heating and melting down the cheese and making sure that the broccoli is refreshed all the way through. And it probably will thicken a little bit more, especially as the cheese melts into the broth, but it's already thickened up quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and put on the heat, and I'm going to put it on a little bit slower heat this time. Not real low, but like a medium, so that it can heat a little bit more slowly, and that will really help with the melting of that cheese as well. And I am going to stir this occasionally as it heats because that's also going to help with the cheese melting. All right, so now this has come up to a simmer. I am just going to simmer and stir for a little bit until it looks like the cheese has finished melting and blending in. If I need to, I'll pick up my whisk and do it like that. But if I can keep this on a low simmer, it usually works pretty well. We don't want to cook it too hot or too long because we don't want to break down any of the thickening agents. Sometimes, I think this one is okay, but sometimes if you have prolonged heat or really high heat, it can break it down. And then your soup or sauce or whatever it is won't stay thick. So I'm going to give that a stir pretty regularly. I'm going to put the lid back on and just let it warm and gently, gently, gently simmer. Okay, at this point, it's been about 5 minutes. And you can see that it's nice and thick and pretty smooth. Not all of my cheese has melted in, but a lot of it has. So I'm going to turn off the heat. And I'm just going to let it sit on the heat a little bit longer. Now at this point or later on, you can take a whisk to it if you want to smooth it down a little bit. Another thing you can do is some people will take their immersion blender and blend either all or part of the soup to make it smoother and less chunky. But like I said, I like some actual pieces of broccoli in my soup. I like that it has all the little bits, but I also like some real chunks. That's just a personal preference. So you can take a whisk to this, which will help smooth out the cheese in the sauce, but it won't really break down the broccoli, or you could use an immersion blender if you wanted to. But I'm going to let mine sit on the heat just a little bit longer and then see where we're at. If you do use a whisk, try to use a pretty big one so that your pieces of broccoli don't get stuck inside of the whisk, so that you can get all those larger chunks out if you need to. All right, it has been 5 minutes now. This is looking nice and thick and smooth. I'm not going to worry about whisking it anymore personally. If there's bits of cheese that haven't fully dissolved, then I'm okay with that. It's still cheese in my soup. And this actually is looking amazing. So let's serve it up and see how it tastes. There's our broccoli cheese soup. We're ready to eat. Smells amazing. That is really good. If you like broccoli cheese soup, you're going to love this. These soups are delicious and so comforting and homey. Besides being lifesavers in an emergency, they also make great gifts and great quick suppers to keep you out of the drive-thru on busy nights. They also help you get used to using some of your long-term food storage and keep it rotated, which are both very important things that so many people neglect to do. Keep in mind, you can adjust these to your liking and to your dietary needs. You can adjust the amounts of salt, bouillon, seasonings. You can swap out the veggies depending on your preference or what you have on hand. I always recommend making up 1 jar of any new recipe that you're trying for the first time. Don't just put it on the shelf. Prepare it and try it and make sure that your family likes it. Everyone has different tastes. Make any adjustments to seasonings and water amounts, whatever you need to do to make it just right for your family. Make sure to make notes on the recipe of any changes that you make. I will have printable recipe pages linked down below for these recipes we did today. Once you're sure your family likes the recipe, then you can make it up in bulk. It's almost just as quick and easy to make 6, 10, or even a dozen jars at once as it is to just make one. Batch cooking at its finest, and you don't even need any fridge or freezer space. You'll be thankful for these meals when you need them. Besides stocking your pantry with meals, don't overlook storing plenty of clean water and a way to cook or heat that food and boil water. Water will be necessary not only for drinking, but also food preparation. A butane stove like I have and the fuel for it are both pretty inexpensive, and they don't take up much room to store. When I bought my stove a few years ago, I think it was less than $20. Of course, the prices have gone up since then, but it's still right around $30, and there's now a store brand option for right around the $20 mark. I'll put links to those down below, as well as links to the non-GMO freeze-dried food that we use. A lot of the ingredients I used in these soups are on sale this month, If you want to stay up to date on what's on sale every month, as well as getting notifications whenever there's a special deal, a flash sale, a coupon code, something like that, you can sign up for my alerts by texting alert to my number right down at the bottom of the screen. And you can also join our Deals and Steals group on Facebook, where I post all kinds of prepper deals I come across. Let me know down in the comments, are you new to Meals in a Jar? And if not, how have you used them? Have they come in handy during power outages? Do you give them to family members and others who could use a meal? Blessing boxes? Do you do anything differently, like using Mylar bags in place of jars or dividing them up for smaller servings? Tell me all about it. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave me a soup bowl emoji down in the comments and check out this playlist next that I think you'll enjoy. I'm Jara with Wicked Prepared. Survive today, thrive tomorrow. We'll see you next time.